Welcome, Craig Foster.
Hi, Jane. Lovely to talk to you.
Lovely to talk to you too. You're a former champion footballer and a leading human rights campaigner. I'm going to ask you about those parts of your life later. But first, I'd like to discuss the approaching coronation of King Charles III at Westminster Abbey in London. I'm guessing that as co-chair of the Australian Republic movement, you missed out on an invitation.
That's true.
What are your feelings about the event?
Well, it would have been a wasted invitation, so
You wouldn't have gone?
No. But so I think Charles made the right choice there. And so I think it's an important moment for Australia in what's an incredibly important and transformative year, you know, with the voice to Parliament and this broader discussion around Uluru Statement and the like. And of course, that has to take precedence this year for all of us. But within that broader context, we have a truly historical moment, first time in 70 years, of the succession of the British monarchy and Charles replacing his mother. And it's a important moment for Australia to see this occur, to reflect on what it means or doesn't mean, or whatever the case may be, you know, how relevant or irrelevant this succession is to Australia, about Australia's relationship with the Crown, which I think is quite quickly evolving and changing. And so this conversation is important within the broader context of where Australia is going, who we are today, and ultimately who we want to be.
So this is sort of an inflection point that we're at and approaching the coronation. What, tell me first of all your feelings about Charles himself. Does his personality or the sort of person he is matter at this moment?
Well, I think it does matter because Charles is still Australia's head of state. It shouldn't really matter because that should no longer be the case. You know, I think it's time for Australia to formally separate from the British monarchy. And by that I mean it shouldn't really matter whether it's Elizabeth or Charles or indeed William or Harry or anyone else, whoever's in that position. It's the position itself that Australia needs to, and I think is undergoing a reassessment and starting to consider much more deeply and in a more nuanced fashion, the complexity of the British Crown and Australian history as to being able to balance for the first time, and certainly in my understanding of Australian history and in my lifetime, the positive impacts and inheritances of the British tradition in Australia, along with the impacts of colonisation and dispossession and racism and attempted genocide and the massacres and these things that Australia is now discussing and having conversations about in a more open way that's never happened before.
Yes, and you know, those big issues are obviously the things that will be considered when we do have a referendum about a republic. But I'm sure that personalities to some extent affect the way people feel. And you know, we all know that Queen Elizabeth was, you know, a lot of Australians had affection for her because apart from anything else, she'd been on the throne for, you know, 70 years. How do you think there is affection for Charles? I think you have said that you don't think there is.
I don't think there's any doubt that the change from Elizabeth to Charles has fundamentally altered the way that many Australians feel about the Crown and the British monarchy, in the sense that they just don't feel the same connection. And so Australia's distance, both culturally but certainly emotionally, to the British monarch now is very different to what it was only 12 months ago. Indeed, as you said, over the last 50 to 70 years. And that's important because, you know, the Governor-General of the day, in fact, called Elizabeth's passing a stepping off moment for Australia. And I think rightly so, because many saw that the affection that a lot of Australia had for Elizabeth, and as you know, I'm not a fan per se of monarchy or royalty as an institution or as a concept. I think it's antithetical to democracy. I think it's a feudal concept, and it's not something that Australia should any longer participate in. But we all have our views on that, and all views, if you like, are valid. And so the important point for Australia is that it's not necessary to be anti-monarchy to be pro-republic. In fact, a huge swathe of Australia have affection for the Crown, not necessarily Charles, but certainly they have fond memories of Elizabeth's reign. But they also are Republicans, because they're simply saying, well, look, you know, we can consign that relationship to the past, and all of us can look back on our relationship with the Crown in any way that we like. And there is a vast range of views, from those who see the Crown representing colonisation and the racist underpinnings thereon, to others who think that it's completely marvellous, and that's perfectly fine. But all of us as Australians can say, whatever you think about the Crown, now I think indisputably it is time now to be walking our own path. And in fact, my personal view is that it's no longer reconcilable, in the sense that as we're walking this path with First Nations, and we're now truth-telling, and we're able to look at the Crown in a very different way and balance these dualities, the positives and negatives, which we should be able to do. As we're doing that, we can recognise that it's time for us genuinely to step off now and say, thank you for what has occurred in the 20th century, but we now understand also the negative impacts much more than we did before, and we think we're walking this path here, and there's no place on that for the Crown.
I mean, in some ways, it just seems weird, doesn't it, that we haven't become a republic earlier?
It does. Republicans come at this from a whole range of different angles. One is around, our own national identity. Some people feel that, Australia should be at a place of maturation now. Well, it's 235 years since first contact, post 65,000 years of cultural survival of First Nations. And by now we should be truly and fully independent. And by that, it simply means that we have our own Australian head of state, someone who lives here, who represents us both here domestically and importantly internationally, and who also embodies and represents all the values that we believe in, of equality and non-discrimination, and of access and representation and multiculturalism. All of these things can be brought to life in a much fuller way. And in fact, I think in some respects make Australia whole, because the kind of concept of an Australian Republic is about uniting all of the different strands of our history. That is the 65,000 years, which we're only really now coming to truly accept, through the Uluru Statement and the Voice to Parliament. And by accept, I mean having genuinely truthful conversations about dispossession, and having real discussions, substantive discussions about what recognition and reconciliation actually looks like. So we've moved from symbolic to substance now. And then we have the British tradition, and Federation 1901 and constitutional monarchy, along with our contemporary multicultural demography, or the migrant story, as we say, albeit, of course, the convicts and Brits were migrants as well onto First Nations land. So these three broad strands of Australian history coming together now, uniting strongly with a firm bond based on truth, and creating a new inclusive national identity for every Australian. And what that means is that every single person of any faith, any background, any culture, has an opportunity to rise to the highest levels in Australia, and that ultimately must include head of state.
So do you think Australia's changed enough in the 25 years almost since the first time that we were able to vote on whether we wanted to sever ties with the monarchy in 1999, the last referendum? I mean, that didn't nearly get up, really. It was decisively defeated, and I think only one jurisdiction, the ACT, voted in favour, and you actually need to get 4 out of the 6, as well as a national majority. So it's hard to get a referendum through, but you feel confident that that Australia has changed enough that next time we vote on this, it'll be passed?
Well, I certainly feel confident that we've had a huge amount of change. There's a number of reasons for that. Demographically, we're very, very different. So we're very proud of our diversity, and we talk about multiculturalism, but I think we need to have this conversation in the next few years, and we are talking about probably at least 3, perhaps 4 years away for a referendum on the Republic and changing to an Australian head of state, and severing our formal ties with the British Crown. And so our demography has changed quite drastically in that time. So over or around 50% of Australia were born abroad or have at least one parent born abroad, and therefore now we are truly diverse in a way that we weren't. And we're also having these other conversations about First Nations. So, 25 years ago, the concept of a republic was kind of, everyone, as we were in 99, let's all go forward and sever this relationship and have our own head of state, and we grow up as a country, and all of those types of narratives from Paul Keating and Malcolm Turnbull and others. But we weren't having really truthful conversations about First Nations and colonisation at that time. Very, very different. The concept was, we're all together here, and without looking back, let's just all walk forward. And I'm delighted and thrilled as an Australian, and I'm quite proud. I think we can be proud of the fact that we're now having these truthful conversations about what happened in 1788 and beyond. And by walking this path with First Nations, we're now coming to new knowledge, new understandings that, I'm nearly 54, and my generation and those before me simply weren't taught. We weren't told the truth about our own country's beginnings, 1788 post, and even prior to, about the 65,000 years of cultural survival. And therefore, we're just coming into new realities. And that's incredibly important, because that changes the whole conception of the Crown. It's no longer about Elizabeth, or whether people liked her or loved her, or what, or whether she was a stable presence and all of the things that you read. It's about a truthful and nuanced conversation about who we are, how we started post first contact, and what we're going to do about it now. And that means this broader conversation about Uluru Statement and others. It means changing our relationship with First Nations. It means changing our conception of who we are as a people and what we stand for and what we're going to do about it. And part of what we're going to do about it is now going to stand on our own and be able to say that that period when we had this formal relationship with the British Crown no longer suits us as a country. And this is a trend, a movement, if you like, that's occurring right across the Commonwealth. I mean, there's only 14 plus UK, but 14 realms, if you like, or countries who still have Charles as head of state out of 56. And Australia is still one of those, but at least 7 or 8 of those 14. So over half those 14 are now on the journey to becoming republics. I see it as a natural consequence. It's obviously a natural step for any former colony is to eventually stand on their own. The only real question is when. And of course, my personal view is the answer to that can only be now, because for a whole range of reasons, and in part because First Nations overwhelmingly are also saying the same thing.
Before we leave the royal family, I was interested to ask you too about apparently Charles recently signalled his support for research about the British monarchy's links to slave trading. What do you know about that?
Really interesting conversations now being had in the UK. In fact, in this respect, they're quite a distance ahead of Australia. And I think that's also because our media and the broader culture in Australia in the later years of Elizabeth's life didn't want to actually delve into these conversations about what the Crown actually means. It was in many ways seen as taboo. And the same conversation's occurring in the UK now, and people who worked at the BBC, for example, are saying, look, we couldn't, we were editorially pretty much blocked from really digging into the history of slavery, of transatlantic slavery that the Crown and former monarchs were involved in. And since the passing of Elizabeth, all of these conversations are now becoming much freer. So what we're seeing around the coronation, really important conversations about how much the wealth of the Crown, so Charles's wealth, and passed down also large land estates to William now, was based on the enslavement of Black Africans and across into the Caribbean. And of course also the former colonization of India, and so therefore these are important. So we're seeing stories now about 12 former monarchs who profited directly from slavery. This has never been discussed before. We see about William's residence, how that had been granted to the Crown from a gentleman, Colston, who had been directly involved and in fact had passed shares over to one of the former monarchs along the line of a hereditary title, who then profited from that slavery. And so all of these things are now coming out. They're not reported so much here in Australia because I think we're still, firstly, we're so focused on the voice at the moment, which is, absolutely appropriate. But this is certainly part of the broader conversation about where Australia is headed. Just to be able to, as Australians, be able to say, look, these were the positive things that were brought here, and of course, the Westminster parliamentary system, which has been, very stable, and which has suited Australia very well, to the High Court and the separation of powers and the rule of law, and these types of concepts are very important. But at the same time, being able to say, this was the racism that underpinned colonisation. This was the way First Nations were mistreated. This is how they were seen as subhuman. These are the massacres that are now still coming to light, over 460 from the work of, fantastic academics at Newcastle University in particular. And all of these things are just coming to light. And as we're able to hold those, differences, in a truthful and accurate way, it becomes clear, I think, to all of us that the only path forward for Australia is now finally to stand on our own 2 feet.
Let's talk about you now. You grew up in the northern New South Wales town of Lismore, and you've told me that your father sort of instilled in you the values that you've taken now into the Republic discussion, which is a belief in the inequality. Essentially, we're all the same, we're all equal. Tell me about that and his belief in a fair go, and whether you think attitudes have changed in Australia. I'm talking particularly about our treatment of asylum seekers, which is something that you've campaigned a lot on. So yeah, sort of tell us about how the way you were brought up has sort of resulted in your work now.
Well, I think my upbringing was very safe, was very loving. It was in an area in the northern New South Wales country, in a place called Lismore, and everyone would know that because we've experienced periodic but recently horrific flooding, and that came to the attention of all Australians. And we saw locals in Lismore, many who'd been there a very long time and others only short period, step forward and actually put their own lives at risk to help and to save people who were in peril in the middle of the night, in floodwaters, which can be incredibly perilous and dangerous, and picking people up in their little tinnies who they didn't even know. I think really symbolises what the country region was, and I hope I don't live there any longer, although my family still does, and I think and believe still does, is about community. I grew up with a very strong sense of community. My father in particular worked across a whole range of particularly sporting areas, from cricket to football and others, and everyone would constantly give what they had to the community entities. So I remember going to what they called working bees. I didn't particularly enjoy it as a kid. I thought I'd rather be out kicking a ball or surfing or something. But we would go up to the club. It was sometimes the cricket club, sometimes it was the football or soccer club. And, you know, my father would be helping put up fences or erect a new clubhouse. And so as kids in probably our early teens, you know, we had to be there cleaning up with the wheelbarrows and helping out. And so these things would go throughout the holiday period, you know, sometimes for weeks. So forget about your holidays.
Yeah.
And so, you know, but that's what people did. You know, that's how they grew up. They come off farms. My father came off a dairy farm. And so, you know, that was getting up at 4 a.m. and you know, milking cows before running off to school, you know, the 4 or 5 Ks, which is why he became an Australian champion sprinter in his high school period. So, you know, it was a tough life by 2023 standards. But it was a life where people needed each other. They had to rely on the other farms around them, if you like, and on the small, what was reasonably small town of Lismore and others, Eltham and Clunes and all these areas. And so people had to trade things, and people had certain skills. So, you know, when the tractor broke down, you needed the farmhouse. You know, the farmer 3 or 4 farms away, you know, happened to have particular skills there, you know, and they needed their help. So it was just this real sense of helping others when they were in need. And that was seen as, you know, it just didn't even need to be thought about. It was just a necessity. And so you know, that was part of my upbringing. And that has, I guess, just infused the way that I live my life. That's all. And so when I tend to see people who are in trouble, who I think either ask for help or I think that I can provide them some support in some way, then I feel, you know, some sort of responsibility to do so.
You've conducted quite a number of humanitarian campaigns, or, you know, trying to help individuals, refugees generally. What's the one that you're proudest of? You know, what do you look back on and think, wow, that we really achieved something there?
I don't really look at it in that way. You know, all of the campaigns, if you like, to help people who are in crisis, whether that's Afghanistan or, you know, the guys on PNG and Manus and indeed now Nauru, or whether it was Hakim Al Arabi or other things, they're always very tense, very fraught with the danger that they might not go well. And therefore, there's never a sense of triumph, or, if you like to use your word, pride in, you know, finding an outcome. It's more really there is a relief, actually. Just the relief that if things go well and things have a positive resolution and outcome, you know, we know intimately what could have gone wrong. And when things go wrong in that space, particularly when, you know, we or I am advocating and trying to encourage Australia to be in, or elsewhere outside of Australia to be involved in some way, if it does go wrong, then the consequences can be horrific. Either that means more days in detention, which is a trauma, you know, for terrified people who have no hope. So you don't know quite what their future holds, you know, from day to day to day. And being in touch with them constantly, daily, you know, you have a very visceral sense of what another 24 hours means. Whereas I guess for most Australians or most people, when you only come to that when you read it in the press. You know, we can read a piece about a refugee, or, for example, who's having a difficult time, or perhaps some of the Australians, for example, who've been involved in hostage diplomacy in Iran or China or elsewhere, where they're, you know, they are stuck in jail. There appears little hope of getting them out. Their family's trying to do so. No one's sure what the government's doing. You know, they make interesting reading. And I think some people can get a reasonable sense of what those people are going through, but it's only actually when you're in touch with them and you feel their emotion that you actually get a sense. When humans are put into the most heinous circumstances, it's an awful place to be. And if you now are involved and have some responsibility, and in fact the people are looking at you to be the person or the people that are going to help them get out, it's those times can be really, really difficult because you're never sure how it's going to end.
I've spoken to people who worked with you closely when you were helping to get young women and girls out of Afghanistan when Kabul fell, and they've said to me that the more pressured it got, the calmer you seemed. That you were sort of became more focused, and that you didn't seem ruffled at all. But having spoken to your wife Lara, I know that this stuff actually really gets to you, and that you lose your appetite and you can't sleep. It does take a big personal toll.
Well, yeah, that's true. I don't see how it couldn't. It's not a campaign, it's a person. It's not a visa, it's a family. It's not a social media statement, it's a life. And therefore you get this sense of gravity that I've never experienced anything similar. You can advocate for change of policy in a whole range of areas, where perhaps the impact on the people around that can be significant, but not necessarily life-changing, life-affirming, or even life-saving. When you're advocating for people who's either in a situation where they might not last another day, either at their own hand or someone else's, then you have this sense of pressure and gravity and urgency that is not a lot of fun. It's not something that you want to get up every day and say, well, this is it's going to be a happy day. It's not happy. And so that can translate across to your life and to your, it changes you. There's no doubt about it. And those campaigns changed me a lot. I came to see how governments can operate. I saw beneath the veneer of the royal families, whether it's on Thailand or in Middle East or elsewhere. I came to see how humans can treat other humans, how we can demonize and marginalize and other them, and how even a wonderful place like Australia is perfectly capable of letting people die if they're convinced that these people are worthless. That's a very, very dangerous place to be. And so I'm committed now to trying to build upon the core values of Australia to put us in a position where we never do that again.
I know that because you have now a name as a human rights advocate and a campaigner, you get lots of requests, like dozens of emails arriving in your inbox all the time. It must be very, very hard to have a moment in the day when you're. How do you relax? How do you switch off? What do you do?
The only way I can really switch off is through sport. That's how I learned when I was a kid, and sport provides an environment where you have to be fully present, and therefore I still like to play. I don't play particularly well in the over 35s.
So you're quite a bit older than 35.
Yes, I've got 20 years on most of the players, and a lot of young ones. I look at them and think, oh wow, I'd love to be 35 again. But it's a lot of fun, and the beauty of it is that it just places you in the moment. And in the last couple of years, I went back to a childhood pursuit something of a love, but I was never really that good at it, but I always wanted to be, which is surfing. And I really enjoy that because firstly, you're there, you know, you're out in the sea, you're in nature, it's always changing, it's quite beautiful. It's very different to running around sweaty, you know, with 2 broken knees and, you know, and a screw in the foot, and, you know, where all the injuries can be an impediment. And it also is the same, you know, that in that moment when you're catching a wave, the brain has to switch off. You have to be absolutely present from the moment that you get on until the moment you get off the wave, however long that is. You know, that moment is just being there. And in those moments, you know, I'm not thinking about all of those emails and the people, you know, and all the girls in Afghanistan who can't, you know, go to school, or the tortures that are happening there and elsewhere, or, you know, the still 50+ people who are stuck on Nauru, or, you know, where the First Nations voice is going and the racism that's coming out around it and how we might be able to push back against that. There's so many areas that need help. In those moments, I can just live for a few seconds.
That's such a good way to end this conversation, actually, Craig. Thank you so much for your time. It's been a real pleasure.
The pleasure's mine, Jane.